Harley-Davidson on a wild ride of its own as Europe threatens a 50% retaliatory tariff on American-made motorcycles. And this isn't the first time, of course, the company has faced the brunt of tariffs. Joining us now is Jaime Katz, Morningstar senior equity analyst. Jaime, it is good to see you. So there was this good piece in the Journal, Jaime. It was kind of noting if the EU imposes 50% retaliatory tariffs on Harleys, prices could soar. And so, Jaime, I'm wondering, investors, you're reading that, you're thinking through that dynamic. How should you try to think about what that could potentially mean for Harley-Davidson?
Well, I think there are a couple different things to factor in here. The first is that in the last cycle of tariffs, there was some sort of exemption that occurred as Harley was able to manufacture some of its bikes abroad and then allocate those units to the EU. The other piece is, when you looked at the composition of retail sales in 2024, really only 1/3 of the retail sales of Harley bikes were happening outside of the US. So in reality, if a bike is $70,000 or $80,000, it's probably priced out of demand. But hopefully, I think the idea is that maybe there can be some persuasion that this doesn't occur so that the European makers don't have the same sort of tariffs or retaliatory tariffs coming into the US.
So there's obviously a lot of uncertainty around what's going to happen with the tariffs. So we're not sure how that's going to impact Harley-Davidson, but I think also there's really stiff competition from European motorcycle makers, right? So that can't help if on top of, an environment where they're already seeing a lot of competition from their peers, that their bike prices might be higher, correct?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. If you look at the last slide deck the company put out, they basically said their market share in the US has fallen to 37%. Now, this is a company that for many, many years was above 50%. And when you look at the EU market share as well, we're looking at 5% market share now. So basically a player that used to be a very important player is shrinking, and sort of how do they reinvigorate themselves to become more relevant, I think is a much more pertinent question than how do the tariffs impact them at this point.
Jaime, I'm curious, so what Harley wants, per the Journal, is its overseas rivals, I guess to face reciprocal tariffs when they would export bikes here. Jaime, what kind of companies, what brands, what names would we be possibly talking about?
I mean, if you think about Triumph, Ducati, and then other names from, Asia that maybe are coming in, it would be helpful to have against like Honda or Yamaha, of course. But I think China's been a much bigger target out of this administration than the EU has in recent weeks.
Jaime, how does the jittery consumer play into this? I can't imagine discretionary items such as motorcycles do very well in an environment where consumer confidence is plunging the way that we've seen it right now. We've seen other discretionary items such as travel, leisure, other things that you tend to see do well in very bullish environments. How does that weaker consumer play into the whole Harley-Davidson narrative?
Yeah, I think we got a great data point update last week from BRP, who also makes snowmobiles and ATVs. And the rhetoric that came out of that call was really that the consumer is sort of on pause right now for some of these big ticket durables, right? Everybody wants to wait and see. If you look at the personal savings numbers, it looks like consumers are holding back just to assess exactly how maybe some of these policies are going to play out and how it may impact their pocketbooks, on a magnitude basis. I think it's been really hard for people to get at what that ultimate impact will be. So a lot of caution still, and I think that's probably what we're going to hear coming out of these companies again when they report Q1.
Jaime, I'm curious, who buys Harleys now? What's the demo? Do we have line of sight there? Is it men, women, high-end consumer, middle, low? And how has that sort of been evolving over time?
Well, I think, this business has gone through a couple of different iterations, right? Under the prior CEO, they were trying to get into smaller displacement bikes. And then Jochen Zeitz came in and said, we're going back to our core competencies. The problem with the core competencies is that is a shrinking market, right? That touring and cruising market. And so you are generating lower volume and maybe better profitability, but perhaps not adapting. So I think when you're looking at the consumers, it hasn't shifted very much. I don't think there has been a vast adoption by women. They've had pushes into the Hispanic market. But at the end of the day, I think you're still looking at that core sort of Caucasian male over 35, and the ability to tap into discretionary income is a lot more difficult for that consumer than it was 20 or 30 years ago when, houses weren't expensive, medical treatments weren't as expensive, student loans weren't as expensive. And so the pie has just sort of shrunk on them. And I think that's been a huge headwind in expanding into a wider total addressable market.
Jaime, thanks so much for joining us today. Appreciate your time.